Anything like that. Perfect. Okay. Not further ado. Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, Ryan, if you see questions on the chat that need immediate, please interrupt me.
Yep.
But for folks in the room, if you have questions about what I'm immediately talking about, I think we could address them kind of there in the moment. But if you have kind of, I guess, grander questions, we'll kind of wait till the end and I'll address those individually. But to start with, I'm Kevin Lindner. I'm the Fire Prevention Education and Mitigation Officer for the San Juan National Forest. I've been in that position for almost 2 years now, but I've been here on the same one since 2011. In fire in a number of different capacities. A lot of that time is spent over on the west side of the forest in the Dolores Ranger District, but a fair amount it's spent here at the Durango office as well. So with that, kind of the intent of my presentation today is to offer you guys a little bit of a deeper dive on our fire restrictions and the context that goes into fire restrictions, why we use them, how we use them, and then how we apply them. Just so you guys, you know, you're my force multipliers. You're out in your subdivisions, you're the ambassadors, you're talking with all the folks in the community. So you guys can have those super educated conversations with all of your persons of interest and provide them maybe with a little bit more information about fire restrictions. So folks are not just seeing that surface level that we're in fire restrictions because it's dry. And that's where the conversation stops, because really it's a lot more complex. So I crave context personally, so I'd like to give it to those in the community who want to receive it as well. And you guys are part of the fire council, so I'm assuming that you guys crave context as well. So, yeah. Are most of you guys, how long have we been here? Just kind of a pulse for most of you guys. Folks from early 2000s been here. Mid-aughts, 2010s.
I think I was. I'm guessing. I'm guessing. I think I was here for
So I just asked that because we used to do fire restrictions one way. We're kind of doing it a different way now. So I'm just kind of trying to see if we have institutional memory in the room at all. But to start with, just kind of the greater context questions is, why do we use fire restrictions? At the end of the day, they are a behavior modification tool. So strictly speaking, around here, fire restrictions are applied pre-monsoon. That's when we tend to be super dry, you know, before that subtropical moisture comes up. And, you know, it brings lightning and it brings fires, but it also has moisture precipitation with it. So it tends to moderate fire behavior a bit, even though it is starting fires. But before that moisture comes up, you know, it's June, we get that super high pressure bubble. This year excluded.
Yeah.
We usually have that June high pressure where it's just hot, it's dry, generally windy, and so and it's like that for weeks on end. So then we kind of go into fire restrictions. Folks who have been here for any amount of time, last year included, you know, we went into strict restrictions. So we do that because, and I say behavior modification, because we are outside of, when we're applying those fire restrictions, generally, we're outside that period where natural fire ignitions would occur, i.e. the monsoon and lightning. So we have to modify the people's behavior. So that's the intent. Because we are trying to achieve that ultimate goal of reducing the human caused fire starts. And human caused fire starts tend to be, you know, the most catastrophic, or they represent our catastrophic wildfire category because of those reasons. They're starting on the hottest, driest times of the year, as opposed to those natural emissions being like. That's why we put so much time, energy, and effort into the human caused fire problem, is because they occur outside that natural condition where they can start in an atmosphere where precipitation would be present with that light, generally speaking. So, pound for pound, human started wildfires, human caused wildfires are significantly more devastating than natural fires. So, and you know, public firefighter safety becomes of main value because with those catastrophic wildfires, they're really large, they're moving fast, they're high intensity. That has, you know, can have very substantial impacts on public and firefighter safety and the values out there, homes, critical infrastructure, all that stuff. So. But before we continue on this conversation, we're going to define a couple of terms so that we're all on the same sheet of music. And again, you guys can have those high quality conversations with folks out in the community. So I'm going to be referring to fire hazard and fire risk. Colloquially speaking, and kind of in society, these terms kind of interchangeable. But for us and for you guys now, as a member of the Wildfire Council, they are going to be distinctly different. So fire hazard, as defined here, it refers to the condition of fuels in a given location and represents the intensity of an area if it were to burn. So it's conveying a certain area and it's roughly speaking how severe or how hot, how large a fire could grow given the conditions. So that's Smoky Bear on the side of the road. You've got that 5-color sign. That's fire hazard. That's telling us what is the condition of our field right now. Now, when we're talking about fire risk, that's referring to the likelihood of a fire starting. So fire risk under conditions where we're applying fire restrictions is going to be humans. You know, for any one area, how likely is a fire to start? And that can be a function of how hot and dry and windy it is. So I just want to kind of draw the distinction between a hazard and a risk. So you guys are kind of parsing that in your mind in this conversation going forward. Go ahead.
Could a fire chimney or geography be considered a hazard? Or is it just rules?
That's different. It is different. So we're just kind of talking fields. Right. But good question. Okay, before we move on, is that clear for folks?
These are two entirely separate ideas that don't influence each other, or do they influence each other at all?
Man, it's that nuanced conversation
Okay.
where fire hazard is trying to describe a condition.
Yeah.
And fire risk is trying to describe an event.
Yeah, okay. Fair.
So hazard and risk are, they are different, but related, of course. So again, it's that nuanced conversation. So, so how do we calculate it? For us here on the San Juan, we have fire danger rating areas. So we have 2 of them, and they are shown here on the map. They are in yellow for chartreuse. We have what is called our upper FDRA, fire danger rating area, and in the purple, we have our lower FDRA. So generally speaking, the purple is kind of the lower country. That's our Mesa Verde, Youth Mountain, and Canyon of the Ancients. So kind of that lower PJ Canyon country. And our upper FDRA, lots of the forest, well, most if not all of San Juan National Forest. So they are broken out that way in that they are trying to categorize those different areas into similar fuel types if like a wildfire were to occur. Whereas here, we're kind of talking high desert. Here, we're talking a forest. That is very broad terms, but that's kind of the reasoning behind those 2 different areas. So in those areas, we have what are called RAWs, RAWS. Those are remote automated weather stations. So they are out there and they are gathering data every second of every day. So we can use those weather stations to inform our forecasts. So, as you can see, the dots on the map, we have these RAW stations gathering information in each of those areas, real time. It's high quality data. It's not just, a forecast with no actual local spatial data. This is rooted in reality. So with that in hand, I'm sorry, you can't see it here, but some significant values for us that those RAWs are gathering are temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, wind direction, and some of the calculated fuel moistures, how wet or how dry the wildland fuels are. And with those input values, then we output two more values. It is an energy release component, and there is a burning index. So again, complex terms, let's define them. There we go. All right. So our ERC, and I'm explaining these because fire restrictions are based very heavily on these calculations of ERC and VI. So very broadly, the energy release component or the ERC is a computed total heat release per unit within the flaming front at the head of a moving fire. So it is trying to forecast or predict the amount of heat coming from a certain area based on the fuels that are there. So we're talking grass, brush, logs. That's defined spatially, but also on the fuel model that we use in our predictions. So with higher ERCs, it's going to burn hotter. Lower ERCs, obviously a little bit lower intensity. ERC is mostly influenced by fuel moisture. So that's gonna obviously impact our ERC, whether it goes up or down. But even cooler is the ERC does a great job of indicating a seasonal trend of how we're doing.
And you said they do this
Twice a day.
twice.
Yeah, we do. So we do a forecast in the morning,
Mhm.
and then we will do an observed product in the afternoon.
Mhm.
Every day from April 1st to November 15th. So ERC is measuring how hot something is going to burn based on how wet or dry the fuel is. Burning index is essentially an estimate of how difficult it is going to be to put out that fire.
How do they monitor that fuel moisture? How does it figure that out?
One of the ways that we do it is once a week or once every 2 weeks, each of the ranger districts will physically go out to look at least a half dozen locations that they have. They'll clip off and saw off little pieces of fuel, and they'll weigh them, put them in the oven for 24 hours, take them back out, weigh them, and then they will have the actual real-time measurements of what is there.
Mhm.
But the RAWs can also make predictions of those fuel moistures based upon the seasonal data that it has of temperature, humidity.
Mhm.
So it has memory of from January 1st all the way to this point in time. It uses all of those observations to predict the fuel. And it's actually surprisingly accurate. So we have real time, like real based in reality, actual observed and predicted both going in. So ERC is one of the inputs for burning index, so they're tied to each other. But that kind of makes sense because we're talking about suppression and how difficult it is going to be to put out this stuff. So high ERC values. Reason would stand that burning index is gonna be a bit higher, it's gonna be harder to suppress. So. BI is heavily influenced by. foods. So that becomes really important in our forecasts. Okay. We on the same sheet of music before we proceed. ERC, how hot it's gonna burn, BI, how hard it's gonna be to put out. Got. So, for us. Just kind of some critical values for you guys to kind of take away with you, if you guys are looking at weather forecast for the day. We have these critical value thresholds, and this allows us to help make some decisions regarding fire restrictions, which we'll get to a little bit more, but just some of the critical values that we operate on for, this is our lower FDRA up here, this is our upper FDRA down here. So these are the actual real-time values that we are heavily monitoring. Day to day. If we are meeting or exceeding those critical thresholds, then that kind of spurs some decision making as well. So these critical values are based upon the incidence of historical large fires here in the San Juan area. So we're talking West Fork Fire, or all the big fires on the west side of the forest. We're using those dates and times when those fires started. We're looking at the RAWS data, and we're using all of that lifetime data to decide what is these critical thresholds where we meet or exceed these. We have these big fires occurring on the landscape.
Is there any consideration when they're doing the BI to the availability of manpower and funding?
Not in the BI, but in considering fire restrictions, yes, but not explicitly in the BI. But it is a consideration.
Do you also produce the red flag ones that we got?
We don't, the National Weather Service in Grand Junction does.
Oh.
So. These products that we're looking at here, these are made by our local fire planner, based on the fire occurrence data going back to the late 60s and weather data. Some of these stations were put in the Dade County. So we have at least 20 years of data for data near all of our RAWS stations, which is really significant. So,
It sounds like you have a great handle on what is driving this is current conditions, past 7 days, some historical data and information. How much does, if at all, does forecast weigh in to this kind of?
okay, we'll get there. But great thing, Brett. So just kind of for you guys, some of those critical thresholds. As far as wind, relative humidity, and temperatures. All right. Okay. So. We've got our values of ERC and BI. Now we are. As the area, as the zone, we're talking about, man, we should maybe get into fire restrictions. We should begin that conversation as an agency between the Forest Service, between the BLM, the BIA, and the Park Service. And the zone board, that's on their weekly calls during fire season. We're talking fire restrictions all the time. And it starts based upon the data, and the data is this. So these are crosswalks for our lower and our upper. So we have our BI goes along the top axis, ERC is along the side of the Y-axis, and you just crosswalk them, those values. And these numbers here represent the stage of restriction that is recommended, be it 1, 2, or 3. And we'll get into those momentarily, but this is the first part of the fire restriction calculation conversation. So you can see lots of it is green, but then, as we start getting towards the upper end of our values, we're getting into the 1s, 2s, and 3s. So this is how the conversation starts. And then it leads to forecast, Brent's got forecast. So this is done over a 7-day period. Go back 2 days, consider today, and then 3 days forward. So we're not prematurely going into or coming out of fire restrictions. So if we do not consider the forecast, as you mentioned, and we're blind to the forecast 2 days out where the monsoon moisture actually kicks up and it comes in, we go into fire restrictions, and then it starts raining 2 days later. Not really helpful to anyone. For the time and energy and effort to implement these and the communication to the public and to influence your behavior, it's not enough time. 2 days is inconsequential. So that's why we're looking at forecasts, both forward, then also considering where we came from. So with these raw values, then it goes to the zone board, which, as I just mentioned, is all of our land management agencies, all our county partners, federal partners, and all the folks there. Essentially decide whether they would like to go into fire restrictions right then and there. We're all going to go in at the same time. If some other agency wants to stagger it a day or two for this, that, for whatever reason. But everyone's talking in this call, deciding kind of all as a group, like, yeah, it's time. The data's telling us we should be in stage 1. We're gonna go in X day at X time. So this is how it's decided. Really, based on a ton of data, and then it comes down to the fire managers and line officers, so district rangers and stuff like that, making the decision to, yep, we had to implement fire restrictions. It's time for some behavior modification. So. Questions up till now? That was a lot of math and terms, so. Here is a historical representation of how we have spent the period from 2010 through 2020 in those various stages of restriction. Be it none, 1, 2, or 3. So thankfully, we've only spent 1.5% of the time in stage 3, which is a full total closure of the public lands. That was 2018. But the rest of the time, mostly spent outside restrictions, thankfully. No. We were pretty lucky this year. We've had, that June soon, if you want to call it that. We had a ton of moisture. But man, it sure rebounded back to being fairly dry, fairly quickly. Well, in Southwest Colorado. So, yeah, there is monsoon predictions. They say it's coming, but we'll see. So, I like numbers, I like context, so this is just kind of how it looks for the past 10 years. All right, enough math. All right. What do our fire restrictions look like? So, as kind of mentioned in those numbers earlier, we have 3 stages. And again, I'm kind of speaking with very, very broad intent here, but stage 1 is, all of our camp cooking or warming fires outside of those permanent concrete or metal fire rings or grates in the developed campgrounds, picnic areas, or day use areas. Campfires outside of those areas are prohibited. So essentially all those dispersed camping sites out in the woods, with the rock rings, no fires there. There are exceptions and exclusions and exemptions in each individual order, which we'll get to the next page. But this is just a very broad painting of restrictions. Stage 2, we go into all camping, cooking, warming fires, including barbecues with charcoal, are prohibited, even in the developed recreation areas. Stage 3, that's the nuclear option. That's where we close the forest down to public use. So because indices are so high of fire hazard and associated with risk is so high that we can't have humans out on the fire, out on the national forest, because if a fire starts, it will be exceptionally considerable catastrophic event. And we will not catch it, and it will go tens of thousands of acres. Case in point, 416 fire. So that's what it looks like.
Were we in stage 3 when that fire started?
416?
Don't think so. I think
We went to very shortly after. We were, if the conditions were merited stage 3.
So
But
we were probably in stage 2.
we were, yes, we were in stage 2. But yeah, we went to that stage 3, closed the forest down. I think it was 11 days that we shut the forest down. And it was really, really challenging. I mean, you can imagine all the ingress and egress roads into a national forest. And, you know, like public in holdings, all the exemptions, you know, the oil and gas folks who still have to kind of go and do their job, like, it's a considerable undertaking to do that. You know, thankfully, we don't have to do that very often. 2018 was the only time in my tenure, going back to 2011, we had to do it. But south of the border in New Mexico and particularly Arizona, they close the forest regularly because it's so dry. So consider ourselves very fortunate up here that our fire hazard doesn't stay crazy high for really, really long. And we don't historically have a terrible human caused fire problem. We just don't, thankfully. It's slowly eking up the human caused fires as we have, you know, increased public use and visitors to the national forest. But compare us to the region 3 forests in Arizona and New Mexico, we're significantly lower. So let's hope it stays that way. And that's where all you guys come in. So you tell people about fire hazard, fire risk, and how we do fire restriction.
Have you used elevation as a restriction?
Brent, you're like one slide ahead of me, bud.
Sorry.
It's okay, no, it's great.
It's a show off.
This just shows me that this is kind of like an intuitive program of fire restriction. So, when the orders come out, be sure to look at them. We post them everywhere. There is exemption or exclusion for what you can and can't do. Like this is the order from last year, where it's saying, you know, the prohibitions are igniting, building, maintaining, attending, or using a fire, including fueled by charcoal briquettes, except if it is, and then it's got 3 exceptions here. So exception A, we're talking about permanent metal or concrete fire pits or grates in U.S. Forest Service developed recreation areas. A big one. Exception B, a device solely fueled by liquid or gas that can be turned on or off. So if you have that, those are always allowed. If you have something with an on and off switch, that is allowed. And that a big kind of point of contention the past couple of years has been these propane fire pits. You know, it emulates a campfire. It has an on and off switch. It is powered by liquid petroleum gas. You can have your propane fire pit. So, the sheriff of Silverton has a slightly different view of it, but that's kind of a local matter right there. But again, it's got an on and off switch. We're good to go.
Now, these rules are broken. Is there a monetary fine that people receive for doing that?
Betcha. So if we are in stage 1, fire restrictions is a $500 fine. if you have a fire in a dispersed or or prohibited area. We are in stage 2, it is a $1,000 fine. You have a fire in a prohibited area. So, and then it's up to the forest protection officer or the law enforcement agent who contacts that public. But they can order a mandatory forest clearance. If they're just like belligerent, they're just not having it, they're totally non-cooperative, campsite's trash. They're having fires, maybe this is like the second or third visit in consecutive nights that we've had out there, then that litigious hammer gets a little heavier. So, but roughly speaking, 500 or 1,000. So it's substantial. So yeah, pay attention to these orders as they come out. They'll be posted at minimum at all of the Forest Service offices, on our social media. And then we have a whole bunch of like signboards, forest portals where we post these things when and if they do come out. So we really do, and we are mandated to post these ubiquitously. So there are a number of things you can and can't do, but just reference those, tell you everything you got to know. I'm gonna talk to Brent now. All right, fire restrictions applied spatially. So, up until last summer, we had been applying a one-size-fits-all fire restriction to the San Juan National Forest. It didn't matter if you were at the Halfland Trailhead by the East Animas, or if you were up at Lizard Head Pass. The same fire restriction applied to both those areas. Now, those are distinctly different elevations, distinctly different fire hazard. So, it became an issue for me, to continue that, that program. So, for 2023, we changed it up and we implemented this kind of zoned approach, if you will. So it split the forest into 2 distinct kind of spatial areas. Again, trying to capture the differences in the fuels and those fuels condition and the fire hazard based upon elevation. So generally speaking, like this is all the wilderness here, and then this is kind of the higher reaches of the Dolores Ranger District. So the fire hazard up here, you know, in the mixed conifers, you know, our Lizard Head passes up in the Weminuche, a little significantly higher, a bit cooler. Fuels don't dry out as quickly seasonally. So the fire hazard up there is going to be, you know, significantly lower than it is down lower. So accordingly, we wrote the forest out into this area, and these 2 distinct areas to where we can apply fire restrictions to one or the other or both, however the science tells us. So like last year, we went into stage 1 in our lower zone. And that's all we had to do last summer. We didn't have to apply that whole blanket to the entire San Juan National Forest. And so that really, in my mind, allows 2 significantly more informational, enriching, and rational conversations with our visiting public. It was very, very displeasing to have conversations with folks up in, you know, the higher reaches of the national forest where the ground's literally solid. And I'm telling them they can't have a campfire, even though it's like 42 degrees at night. So rest assured, we have kind of rethinked our aims. And we've got this zoned approach to better serve the public, in my mind, to allow folks to enjoy the national forest a bit more rationally, allow for a user experience that is less prohibitive and more informed with our data. So does that answer your elevation question, Brett? Sweet. So yeah, with that zoned approach, you know, we fire managers, line officers, district rangers, myself, we went through a ton of time and energy to draw those lines rationally and have them make sense, and really to avoid that situation where one side of the road, you can have a campfire, the other side of the road, you can't. It sucks, but at the end of the day, you have to draw the line somewhere. You really do. We really tried to minimize that, but the line is still there, so.
Are there ever conditions that exist that would suggest that a higher elevation would be a greater hazard than another elevation? Or is it generally not that, that's not the case?
Generally, that's not the case. But you could see it in the change of the seasons, late summer, early fall, where we get that seasonal kind of change where it's cooler nights, cooler days. And the fuels in the lower elevations, generally smaller, they dry out, or they get wetter quicker. As compared to the high elevations where we just have, big timber, heavy dead and down laying on the forest floor. That stuff responds slower to moisture. So it could be the case where the higher elevations are a bit drier than down low. But it wouldn't be for a substantially long time to, in my opinion, where you would apply a fire restriction up high and not down low. But it could occur, certainly, absolutely.
If you had an area that had murder on, you got a fire deficit evaluation of some sort. I guess that's reflected in the ERC. And then essentially amount of fuel on the ground.
Yes.
And
Absolutely. Yep. Good question. Well, yeah. That's my presentation. I hope that gives a little bit of context to fire restrictions, and more importantly, not so much on the fire restrictions themselves, what's allowed, what's not allowed. I think you guys are familiar with that, but just the context of why and how. That hopefully you guys can share with your publics, so that they can share with their publics, and we'll just have a better informed society, and we maintain that minimal human caused fire regime we have around. So with that, if you guys have questions, either here in the room or out in the world, I'm happy to answer.
that's great info.
Yeah. Do we have any questions online?
I have a question just about, obviously there's coordination between the national forest and also local and municipalities and other land agencies, but I'm curious, like across different forests, is there communication on that scale, or how does that work?
There is communication on that scale, certainly. But again, that comes into that situation where at some point there's a line on the map. And the FDR, the fire danger rating areas on the Rio Grande, their data is gonna tell them a bit different than what we've got. So even though like on the borders, like those conditions, not super highly variable, on one side of Wolf Creek Pass to the other, pretty simple. But if you're talking like Boggy Draw versus not like the Rio's tongue, but some of the landscapes out there, they could be distinct. But that is something of consideration, like, yeah, we border the G-Mug up here on the North Lizard Head, we border the Rio Grande on the Wolf Creek, and there's always that conversation, well, why are we in fire restrictions on that forest? It's not, it's all because of what we just talked about. And at some point, you have a line on the map. So, yeah.
Do you think things are gonna change? We are expecting a new radar. And we are about 4 hours away from the closest National Weather Service radar. So when these predictions are being made, I mean, if you think about it, how often are weather forecasts accurate? I mean, it's so far. I mean, it's 50-50 in Chicago, but out here it's, 20.
Yeah.
So you think all these maps and stuff may be affected, because that is part of how you guys are evaluating which areas are more likely, et cetera.
I think it will affect it. I don't think it'll affect the maps or spatially how we do things in the short term. But I think it will supply us with significantly more informed forecasts. For the short term, the shorter term, the seasonal term. Because yeah. Forecasts from Grand Junction, like, God bless them, they do their best, but this is just historically a very hard place to forecast for. We have the shadow of the Dopplers. So yeah, it is super challenging. I think it would, our data up until now, obviously it will stay the same, but I think our forecasting. If, when and if it does get better, I think that will inform us in our policies going forward.
Why we have the Durango lake.
True.
Yeah, and that's why we rely heavily. We have incident meteorologists who we bring down. Meteorologists from the weather service. We have like large fires or during prescribed fire seasons in the spring and the fall. We bring a meteorologist here, have them on site. To give us those accurate forecasts at the, local spatial level and not from 4 hours away, as you say.
If we have a development that borders. Ever do any cooperative mitigation work with developments, have that?
Yes. Yep. There are increasingly more tools in the toolbox to achieve cross-boundary stuff like that. Historically, it has been very.
There's one going on right now, right? Durango Hills.
Yep, Durango Hills, Grassy Mountain. There's lots of tools in the toolbox right now. There's a number we can do via prescribed fire or fuel stuff, fuels treatments. But yeah, there's a lot more options on the table as opposed to historically.
And if we wanted to pursue something like that, would we contact?
I will contact your fuels management specialist on each of the districts. So which place you talking is on the Columbine Range District?
No, we're up Florida.
Okay, so that'd be Columbine. So I would get a hold I would reach out to Noah Daniels on Columbine Range District. He's their fuels AFMO and he's a great place to start.
Okay, we do have a couple of questions online, so Roger, if you want to go ahead and unmute.
We have a question. I remember a couple of years ago, there was a fire started up around Texas Creek by someone shooting a gun with a bullet, creating a spark off a rock. Are there any restrictions in target shooting during fire restrictions that you've talked about?
Yes. Yeah. So in addition to we have a full-time prohibition on exploding targets right now. At least for the San Juan National Forest. That particular incident was started by a ricochet. And once you get into stage 2, reading into the order, you will see language speaking to target shooting.
Gotcha. Thanks, Roger. And then Mary Haskins was asking if we could have access to the PowerPoint presentation.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll share it with you guys.
And then she also wanted to know if the ERE assessments are daily from what dates? You said April 1st to November 15th?
Yep.
Okay. Cool.
That's when we produce that full-blown NFGRS calculator product.
Gotcha.
Because that's our fire season based on the data is April
Sure.
1st to November 15th.
Sure.
It's still being calculated every day of the year. It's just between those dates when we do the full scale deal.
Okay.
Another question, maybe a silly question, but.
Silly question.
You talked about going into fire restrictions, coming out of fire restrictions, the same process, but just kind of opposite? Or are there any other processes that happen to come out of, go to a lower stage?
Very similar, almost identical. Generally speaking, there is a moisture event that happens. And all the fire managers, line officers are like, we look at the data, we look at the forecast. to see if that was just like a short-lived thing. Did we get that quick, 1/10 of an inch of rain, and then the 10-day forecast is we're gonna go right back to mid-90s with howling winds, or are seasonally? So yeah, it's a similar process. Flip it on its head.
Have you seen any significant differences, between the high desert PJ and like the higher elevation in ponderosa forest when you're doing the burning index and the energy?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, what are those?
So the ERC. Back up just a tiny bit. Cut. So. You can see our lower, you can see our upper. And right here. You see ERC-Z and you see ERC-X. The X and the Z, those are fuel models that are being put into the system to account for the differences in the fuel types. So your Sage and PJ versus, Ponderosa Pine or the Z. So, that's how that accounts for it. So you still get similar values, they're not wildly different. Because they're being accounted for with the fuel models.
Those fuels are just gonna dry out at different rates and things.
Yes. Dry out different rates, they're gonna be loaded at different weights, so tons per acre, how much fuel is on the landscape is gonna be different for the Sage PJ as compared to, Ponderosa Pine. So fire is gonna move faster and maybe hotter through your Sage and your PJ, but it's gonna be a short-lived event. Whereas up in your Ponderosa Pine or your mixed conifer, it might be a little bit slower, but it's gonna be there for a lot longer.
There are lots of background calculations to those models.
Yes.
1 hour, 10 hour, 100-hour fuels, things like that.
Yep. And if you want to dive into that, I would advise you go home, check out Google. Put in Anderson's 13 fuel models, start there, find yourself a wormhole. It's great.
So these restrictions, they apply to private property also,
No,
no? So if you're.
not us.
Okay,
So municipalities, counties, they will implement their own restrictions. Typically, it is defined as a burn ban. So it just prohibits you from burning like a debris pile, even if you have a permit. So and again, private land is a whole different thing. I'm purely talking about public. If you want to know about the public, your private land, what county are you? La Plata has an amazing wildfire resource center. Where you can learn everything about that. But yeah, private land is a different monster, but they do go into restrictions and stuff.
they have their own.
Yep.
But as you said earlier, the federal agencies kind of confer with some of those people in the counties when it comes to that, so they're a lot on the same page most of the time.
Yeah, we're all talking, when and if we're going into restrictions, we really like to line up. So we can kind of all go in relatively together and not just the scattergun of time and spatially. So does that answer your question? This is just public.
Okay, we have another question online from Donna.
Hello, Kevin, you mentioned that the specific orders that accompany a restriction when it's issued are posted at various locations and also on social media. Can someone just go directly to the website to find those as well? The United States Forest Service website or?
Yes.
Okay,
You can absolutely go to the San Juan National Forest, just website. There'll be big banners on the top right-hand side of that page. And that'll take you right to it.
Okay, great, thank you.
Just a question about, I mean, I know that you can't really speak for Bureau of Land Management. In your sense of it, do they follow a pretty similar process of issuing restrictions?
Yeah. Yeah, we all report to the Office of the General Counsel. So, we all have the same, legal authority, legal processes to go into fire restrictions. The BLM, they're one of the partners at that table of the conversation. So, yeah, it's very, very, very similar process.
And if there was a discrepancy, not in a negative way, but between stages of restrictions between BLM and US Forest Service, that's purely like geographical.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's all number driven. Cool. I apologize if I went over time.
No, that was great.
Good stuff.
Awesome. Thank you so much,
Cool.
Kevin.
Thank you.
Okay, and we have a couple minutes here, I think. Let's,